everyone. Thank you for joining IIDA, Gotti, and Galen Krantz Consulting for the chair, How Seating Impacts Project Success and User Health. Before we start, just a couple housekeeping items for review. So we are using this Zoom system for our webinar, and you'll see that there is a Q&A feature and a chat feature to share questions and thoughts. So feel free to use that during the presentation, and we'll kind of have some time at the end to address some of those. So feel free to do that. And then if you're having any issues with audio or video, you can let me know that as well via the chat feature. Okay, so just another couple items. This webinar is worth one HSW CEU. At the end of the webinar, I'll share the code with you. Basically, attendance reporting is based on your registration and your time logged onto the webinar. So that means you have to stick around for the full hour in order to get the credit. If you're watching this webinar as a group, feel free to reach out to the brand@iida.org email, which I will post in the chat for more information on how to receive credit for everyone who's watching. I'll be sharing that information with our educator director, and she will facilitate reporting to IDCEC for all attendees. So we'll follow up with more information on that. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I will hand it over to Joe to get the webinar started.
Thanks, Ellen. So like Ellen said, the title of the webinar is The Chair, How Seating Impacts Project Success and User Health. Your first presenter today is going to be Galen Krantz. She is a graduate professor of the Graduate School of Architecture at University of California, Berkeley. She's also author of The Chair, Rethinking Culture, Body, and Design. She has won awards like EDRA's 2004 Achievement Award and 2011 EDRA Career Award. And she's also taught body conscious design since 1989. I will be your second presenter, Joe Gotti. I'm with the Gotti Furniture. I'm the director of design there. For those of you that have attended our webinars in the past, you'll be familiar with me. I have background in product design and project management and product development. We actually connected with Galen through a radio piece that I heard her on, and coincidentally, my father was actually reading her book at the same time, and we both kind of came into the office together and said, "Hey, we should kind of talk with Galen. She's got an interesting, unique take on seating and culture and how seating design has been developed, kind of throughout human evolution." So that was kind of how we first got connected. And so as we'll go through the presentation here, I think Galen brings a unique, interesting perspective on sitting and posture and how it relates to, and how it fits into the cultural development of the chair and how it relates to our health. So with that, Galen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joe. So here we go, the story of seating in our lives. I read an article in the 70s that started out trying to explain what they called the inherent instability of the seated posture. What they explained was that when you sit back on a chair back, as you see in the leftmost image here, twin forces are set in place that take you both down and forward. The pelvis scoots forward, more forward, and eventually you're so flexed and bent, reversed your lumbar curve, you feel strained, so you sit up, as the woman has set up on the far right one. But the article went on to explain, without back support, you tire, so you scoot back and accept the support of the chair back, in which case those twin forces are set up again, and you slide forward and you do the whole thing over again in a continuous cycle. So the argument was that chair sitting isn't, you can't really design rationally for chair design because our posture is so unstable. Eventually, do I have control yet, Joe?
Yes, you do.
Okay, let's see here. There we go. Eventually, I decided to train mid-career to become a teacher of the Alexander technique, which is a system of posture and movement developed by an Australian who moved to London in the early 20th century. And in that training, I began to see that there was an assumption built into that argument about inherent instability. Because I looked around and I said, okay, like here's the Buddha, he's sitting upright, he's in stone, so of course he doesn't feel any stress. But living people do sit like this all over the world, in China and Japan. And here's the architecture that supports that way of life in Japan. And in Egypt and Algeria, you see both earlier depictions by painters, and then on your left here, that's a photograph I took myself in contemporary Cairo. So people do sit without chairs all over the world. So I asked myself, where then did chairs come from? And most furniture historians will take us back to the Egyptian pharaoh or the Fertile Crescent, and where the king was elevated on the throne, as is the pharaoh. And it is a chair because it's for one person and it has kind of a back. So that is where most historians stop. But I had the opportunity to speak with people in the archaeology department at UC Berkeley, where I have been teaching, and I met someone who knew about this relatively recent find in the former Yugoslavia from in women's grave sites. They found these little kiln-fired figures of females in a single chair with a back, and these ceramics are only found in women's graves and only showing women in them. But for our purposes right now, what's important is that these are dated 75,000 BC, whereas the Neolithic thing, the pharaohs take us to 2500 BC. So another 5,000 years has been added onto our history of chairs. And so, of course, I wanted to know, let's go further back. And the archaeologists assured me that really the only evidence we have about the earliest human life is from cave paintings in the Paleolithic era, about 40,000 years ago. And they show animals, very seldom a human, and even less often any piece of equipment, and never a chair or a seating implement. So we may never know exactly where chairs came from, but I would say that since what we do know about their origins suggests that they've had a connection with social status. That was only women, only in women's graves, or only the royalty. So there's something going on with chairs elevating status or marking status. And I believe that to this day has come down to us and has kept us from thinking really rationally about chair design. If you, like, for example, if you don't offer somebody a chair, that's considered rude. If you go into an office for a job interview, you know which chair is yours to sit in. You don't go sit in the big guy's chair or the big chair because it belongs to the boss. Thanksgiving, the chair that has the arms on it is not for the weakest person in your family, but usually for the so-called head of household. So status, I think, is still a hidden part of our relationship to chairs. So from that ancient beginning, we're going to go now zoom forward to classical Greece, where the klizmos chair was invented. Many historians like this as evidence of ease, but personally, I think it's the beginning of the end, where we start slumping as this person is depicted. The Romans brought us a different kind of a couch. They kept the throne and the klizmos, but most social life was conducted in something that we might say is closer to a bed here. In fact, they had a very specialized architecture called the triclinium, which was the Roman way to conduct banquets. You'd have 3 people here on one side, 3 people at the bottom of that U shape, and 3 at the other side, all lying on bolsters, being served food from the center, food and wine. So their faces would be very intimate. And in fact, the Last Supper, being a Roman event, would have been a lying down recumbent event like this. But as our culture became more and more of a chair and table culture, our artists changed the depiction of the event to, to make it look like it was a chair and table event, which it was not. Supposedly in the Dark Ages, furniture and many other forms of culture disappeared altogether and had to be invented, rediscovered. And again, they were invented with the king being elevated on those steps and everybody else on the ground. And here is, in fact, on the right, an extant 13th century throne. Another influence on the redevelopment of the chair are storage boxes that lined the interior halls of manor houses. Apparently, life was politically unstable. You had to be able to leave. You couldn't leave things in your manor house. They had to be packed up. So everything was kept in boxes that were pushed up against the wall. And I think these chairs look very much like a box pushed up against the wall. A third and very interesting influence is the misericord, named after the long songs, 5 to 6 hours worth of singing that took place in medieval chapels and churches. What's interesting from a body point of view here is that you can sit on the far right, you can sit in a classic right angle seated posture. But it turns out you can't sing very well in that position. You have to stand, but you can't stand for 5 or 6 hours. It's too fatiguing. So see what they've worked out at the bottom of the seat? There's a little carved piece, and that seat is on a hinge. So when it flips up, bingo, that little carved piece becomes a seat just big enough to hold your 2 sit bones. And so you perch. That is, you're not standing, you're not sitting, you're halfway between sitting and standing, a position I've decided to call the perch position. And I think it's very important to see that the wisdom of this position goes very far back in our history. But first, we zoom forward here to the 18th century, which furniture historians view as the sort of apex of chair design. They like the fact that there's integration, visual integration between the size of the legs and the back. They like the rounded front rail. They like the small amount of horsehair padding for comfort. And of course, they love all the symbolic expression in the carvings on the chair back. What they don't like is this 19th century development, which was spring coil upholstery and the newly cheap upholstered fabrics. Fabric had been a luxury before the invention of mills and looms. And so there's an impulse to show off being able to have this luxury. But the underlying structure of these spring coils, so that if you sit on this, your butt basically sinks down, and your ischial tuberosities, or your sit bones, the little bones that you can feel that touch the surface when you sit, they sink into this coil, and the coils go up around them, so flesh gets pressured, and it takes on a load-bearing function for which it is not designed. Load should just be transferred down through bones, not flesh. So they don't like this for aesthetic reasons, that it doesn't show what the structure is. Whereas they do like what happened with the Tonnet steamed wood chairs. because here the structure is the art. And by 20th century values, that's important. In the 20th century, basically we entered an era of experimenting with new materials while the body was neglected. Breuer had an aha moment and when the bicycle went by and he thought, ooh, that tubing, this new strong tubing, I could maybe make a chair. And he made one called the Seska, named after his daughter. And then he made the Vasily, which is named after his painter friend, Vasily Kandinsky. And this one, from a body point of view, takes you off your center, you sit fairly far back. That means you have to bring your head forward, and it creates a slump in the collapse in the middle of your chest. All of these chairs are important 20th century icons. I think Mies van der Rohe did the Barcelona that reverses the lumbar curve. It's way too deep. The seat is way too deep for most people. 3 Argentinian architects did this butterfly chair, again, taking advantage of the new tensile strength of new metal alloys. But the body just sits in a kind of a curve, like a sack, which is not so great for the spine or for the organs that get kind of, well, shall we say, piled on top of one another. New materials, mid-20th century, plastics. And so, this middle one, the Saarinen 1950 prize of the MoMA's organic chair competition. It's called organic because it's curved. But I argue that it's not so good for the organism, because when you curve around your rib cage or your pelvis, you subtly turn in the hip bones or the ribs, and you subtly compress the torso, rather than being against something flat that allows those same bones to open and make more space. So again, it's showing that in this next ribbon-like one, it's exploiting the fluidity, the plasticity of plastic. And the last one is a Scandinavian contribution, a tour de force of what you can do with only one piece of wood, getting both the back and the seat. But again, it's curved, your hips are curved in on themselves, and this edge at the top can be rather painful. Inflatables, 1968, again, a new technology allowing us to play with chairs in a whole new way, but without regard for the welfare of the body. And then finally, the new plastics allowed these sort of potato chip-like structures to be tucked under your arm so you could go to the beach and not be crude and lie down, heaven forbid. Oh no, you could sit up, be civilized, and read the New York Times. So you might wonder, where did I get this, shall we say, unorthodox view? Well, the science behind all this is that when we sit at right angles, the musculature behind the thighs is attached to the pelvis and pulls the pelvis backward, which then flattens the lumbar curve. Whereas on the far right, you see when we stand, we have a lumbar curve, and then we have a thoracic curve, and then we have a cervical or neck curve forward again. So it's kind of a, you might say, a very elongated S. A C shape in the right angle position is a weaker form than the elongated S. You know, if you think about a heavy weight on a C shape or an S, the S is the stronger shape. The good news here about the perch position, halfway between sitting and standing, is that you keep the elongated S shape of the spine. You keep your lumbar curve, and you're going to see how important that is. That position is called neutral body posture by NASA, because when there's no gravitational force on your body in outer space, the musculature of the front and the back balance out in this flexed, some perch-like position. And there's a guy really floating around. An American surgeon got interested in the problem of slipped discs. So he studied what happens to the lumbar vertebrae where the slipped discs happen. Because one edge of two vertebrae get too close to each other and they press the disc in between, and it pushes out against the spinal cord, and it's very painful. The most neutral position is lying down on your side. The worst is sitting up and then bending forward down there, K. The only thing worse than sitting conventionally, is sitting with your legs up or bent over. Notice that squatting is vastly superior. Cross-legged, this one for some reason is okay too. I'm not quite sure. I've not paid proper attention to that gizmo right there. Whoops, sorry. I'm going to get back here. This is one, there's a chiropractor who's made a reputation for himself saying it's good to slump. And that's because he doesn't mean slumping forward like the guy down here in position K. He means slumping backwards like this. But notice that that's reproducing the perch position. So our sitting is problematic, but we continue to do it. And here designers respond to the problem of the forward slide of the way the body scoots forward that we noticed in the first image. So they cant the front of the seat up half an inch or so compared to the back in order to stop that slide, but it doesn't really work. So he crosses his legs in order to have more force down to stop the forward slide. And then designers have noticed that, okay, if we cant the front of the seat up, we're certainly have less than 90 degrees, so let's open the back up. And they've done that. But if the sitter accepts the trajectory of the chair back, his head would be about a foot and something further back than it is. That would be an untenable, difficult position to sustain. So, of course, he brings his head forward, but let's see what happens to his spine. His spine is going back, 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 and then all of a sudden it has to turn pretty sharply and come up there under the middle of his neck. So over time, he's going to build that, his musculature will start to hold that position permanently, and he'll get a dowager's hump. And people will say, well, you have to go get old somehow. Whereas it doesn't have anything to do with age. It has to do with this cultural practice we have of sitting in chairs. And we think it's so great to sit that we want to sit while we work. But look at these two characters in this advertisement for seated lawn mowing. Their ears do not line up over their shoulder, over their hips. No. Their heads are way forward. And yet we think this is a good thing. We persist in thinking that this right angle seated posture is ideal. But look at the irony here. There's the ideal in the poster above, and then there's the reality of what a guy has to do in order to do his, in this case, typing. In order to see he's rounding his spine terribly and putting a lot of strain on his lower back. Children have an even shorter focal length than we adults. So if we don't give them a high forward sloped surface to work on, we're really hurting their backs because they have to squinch so far forward in order to see. There is a chair reform movement. Dr. Mandel wrote a book called Homo Sapiens, in which he shared his discovery that this open angle between thigh and trunk is vastly superior. And the architect and designer Peter Opsvik, a Norwegian, designed the balance chair not because he thinks it's so great to kneel, but because he wanted to lower the body in space to use the tables that we already have. If you were to work in the perch position, you'd have to have a higher table. And culture is quite conservative. It makes us want to keep what we have. So he figured out, okay, if we bend the knees, we can lower the body in space. But it's not great for the knees, and you lose feedback from the soles of your feet. But nevertheless, this back is in the man in the middle. His back looks better than when he sits in a conventional chair to the far right. The same designer, Peter Opsik, went on to design another chair where you can perch rather than sit on your knees. It has cutouts. This is called the capisco, which means I understand in Italian. And it has cutouts in the seat so that the thigh can drop through. Other reformers have been playing around with Italian physio balls, or one Italian physician had all her waiting room chairs adjusted just this tiny little bit, just so that there's a little bit, the hips are just a little bit higher than the knees, or put the other way, the knees are a little bit lower than the hips. That's one rule of thumb for thinking how to save your lower back in a chair. Physical therapists are taught to administer therapy holding this position, not bending over their clients. But here, if we are going to wash our hands or do our dishes, we need to get out a screwdriver and undo the doors in our under sink cupboards so that we have a space for our knees to go forward rather than rounding the spine, drooping the spine over the sink. Use the big muscles of our hips and our legs to do the pivoting. Peter Opsik, again, thinking about how to conduct a meeting while keeping very active, made this prototype. I got to teach a class at Anderson Ranch Art Center called High Style, Body Conscious Chair Design. And this was was probably the best of the show, offering 2 perch positions in this nice sculptural form. From a policy point of view, I would like all interior specifiers to think about A, B, C, and D sizes. We have shoe sizes. We have clothing sizes. I think we need to have chair sizes, as the Shakers did here in this Mama Bear, Papa Bear, Baby Bear arrangement. Here's a very modest version of size difference. I saw this in Sweden at a bar in a public place. The bar itself is different, and so are the seats. The other end, we need to think about the feet, especially since anybody under 5'6" doesn't do well in an 18-inch chair off the ground. That's the standard, 18 inches. But it's really too high for way more than half the population. Fashion gets in our way. This guy designed this, and he thought it was cool, even though his knees are way higher than his hips, and it's way too deep for her to use. But he didn't care because in its day, he thought it was cool. At Anderson Ranch, we experimented with a conventional chair that would be forward tilted the opposite way that most are. We found that you could forward tilt 10.5 degrees without sliding off. We made lots of space for the roundness of the spine and the buttocks here. And the back was raised high enough to just, if you do use it, it's just between the 2 curves, between the inward lumbar curve and the external thoracic curve. Okay. Italians have known the importance of forward slope for work. Dr. Mandel, again the Dane, got the European school furniture standards changed to allow these higher chairs. Sad note here, though. I lectured at Aarhus University 10 years ago, and the architecture students said, oh, that's why we had those chairs. Nobody bothered to tell them why they had these higher than usual chairs that you can perch on here or sit back on here. So education, I think, is always part of the deal. We can't just design our way out of problems, but we do need environment to support the good behaviors. So here, thinking about the head-neck connection, we need to read with a forward slope, not flat surfaces. We need to have comfortable places to lie down to lengthen the spine for 15 minutes. This is called constructive rest in the Alexander world. But there are gender issues, especially for women, lying down, being viewed as lying down on the job. We need I like benches because they allow you to lie down as well as accommodate lots of people for sitting. All right, so Opstick, once again, did a chair that allowed him to do his balance thing, do conventional sitting, but most importantly, this bottom position takes the perch position, rotates it in space, and becomes what the lounge. So the lounge is a very important way to work. Corbusier and Charlotte Perriand designed this one in 1925, still available to us today, recommended by physicians after people have had back surgery because it's the most neutral for our backs. The Finns were the first to discover that you could, when the keyboard got freed from the monitor, that they could start working in a lounge position. I myself have tried to set up a living room that allows the lounge position and the flat position for constructive rest. Action is turning out to be very important, activating the feet. So Opstick has taken a conventional height chair, but put little crossbars on these chairs, these table legs, so that you can use your feet to push and keep your feet active. And of course, that's the principle behind rockers. And I think it's great to see them in public places. I'd like to see them in libraries and schools, and lots, every home should have one. But I think our public environments, our work environments would also benefit from these. Here's really active seating, the focal upright. It's a pivoting stool where your feet are also have to be active. But here, this maybe takes the cake. On the right, a bicyclist bicycles to work and unlocks his bike into place for his work life. Harvard's Graduate School of Design has carpeted stairs. And I'm ending with this image that involves an ecological scale problem. Here, the beach in Santa Barbara, the cliff edge was being eroded by people coming to watch the sun go down, sitting at the edge with their six-packs and swinging their legs, and erosion. So policymakers thought, okay, let's just make it more attractive to sit back from the cliff edge. They could have put up a cyclone fence or something ugly, but they just made it nicer to be back here, hired an architect and an artist to do this installation. It involves a picnic bench, but very importantly, this sort of lounge-like configuration where you can sit with a friend, have your six-pack, watch the sun go down, and protect the earth. So I like to think that if we're nicer to our bodies, we're also going to end up being nicer to the environment, for the earth, that allows us to be here in the first place. So whether indoors or outdoors, I'm hoping we'll be more body friendly. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Galen. I'm gonna take it over from here now. So Galen's given us some interesting kind of perspective on the history of the chair and body posture, and trying to combat this traditional 90-degree right angle seating. So what I'm going to go from here forward is kind of just hone in on the furniture a little bit and try to, understand that obviously we've made investments in furniture in these spaces, and that I think Galen is showing us what is an idealistic place we want to move towards. But what do we want to do in the meantime? So we want to create as many opportunities to have, a more appropriate body posture and avoid as many negative body postures as possible. So like Galen started off with a little bit of history, I'm going to do the same as well. So if we just look at the way we've worked, let's say, post-industrial revolution up into the 50s, and even let's say late 80s, early 90s, we're always in this factory style mentality of work. We're somewhat chained to our desks, and that's probably driven some of the body posture that Galen's talking about, and us really not thinking about how people should sit. It's more about how we just get work done and move on to the next thing, next task. Well, as we come into late 90s, early 2000s, you start to have this shift in technology, especially leading into today, where the vehicle in which we do work, a computer, is now cheaper, smaller, more mobile, flexible. So we're starting to see a greater trend in that we don't need to be chained to a desk. We can be productive somewhat anywhere. So we're seeing this reflected in office spaces where large trend is to move away from somebody owning a desk to I can work at my desk, I can work in a lounge chair, I can work in somewhat anywhere I want. And while that's a great opportunity, I think we need to start asking ourselves, what is the most appropriate places for us to work in? So today we're going to just talk a little bit about kind of the investigative process, just to kind of start with. And we're starting to look at a space, how do we want to understand what's the best kind of direction we want to go in, and then looking at how, when coming out of that, how do we break things down into activity patterns? And we're very deliberate in not saying work patterns; it's really about activities. And then from there, looking at how what kind of furniture types, seating types, and how do those break down into those activity patterns. So to start off, we talk about how to balance our space. And so usually I take people through this, I guess what I would consider a prototypical product development process. It starts with observation, getting an understanding of what's going on, whether it's surrounded by an individual product. In this case, we're going to talk about space. So looking at what's happening in space and then doing an investigation. So typically we're working with a client, it's what the activities are taking place and where they're taking place. So it's not so much what's going on, maybe it's reading, writing, studying, meetings, social gatherings, whatever it may be. It's taking note of that, and also taking note of where it's happening in the environment. What you'll find is that people, will say like, oh, I like, you'll observe that kids like to sit at the large table, but you realize, well, the large tables have power and they're next to the window, and that's really why they're gravitating towards that. So they just happen to be forced to use maybe a table that's not as conducive to them. Or they could like all the above. That's what's going to come into the investigative part of this. So I encourage people, when you're doing your observation, because people will say, well, we like to do surveys and ask people and, and try to like drill in from there. And I think that obviously is a part of the investigation process, but I think it should come towards the end. And really we should kind of be reflecting and asking why as many times. Until we really feel like we understand what's driving the behavior or the desire to do something. So, for example, I've given this example a number of times. I was working with a client and they wanted to replace all of the large tables in their space. I said, okay, that's great. So, why do we want to replace the large tables? Well, they're falling apart and the students really love the big tables. Oh, okay, well, that's great that they love the big tables. So, what do they love about the big tables? Well, they just love the big tables. They sit there and they work. Okay. Well, there's probably something they like about it, and it's not just because that it's a large table. And so, walking around, looking what's going on, we notice, oh, well, I noticed these tables off in the corner, and they're the high tables. And I said, well, what's going on with those? He's like, oh, well, those are those high tables we put in a while ago. The students seem to go there first, start to work, and then when those fill up, then they start to fill in these bigger tables. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. We started off saying that the students love the big tables, and we want to replace all of those. But people are gravitating towards this other spot first. So what's happening over there? And again, this is where the point the survey can kind of come into play and say, well, what place do you prefer to work in? Why? We come to find out, well, those high tables are by the window. They have slightly better power access. So it wasn't so much about the height. They did like the space. But, you know, it's really like, how do we maybe take advantage of the area to maybe it's not so much large tables, but smaller tables that we can position a little better to get better light, better access to power, and address it from there. So what I try to get people to think about, it's more about what people are doing and what do we want them to do, and starting the conversation from there. So we, you know, say, oh, we want to have an environment. We want to have, you know, we observe people like X, Y, and Z. We really want the space to achieve X, Y, and Z. And then start saying, well, what product do we need in there versus, oh, I need some lounge chairs, I need some tables, I need to sit 125 people. You know, and you can start from that point of view, but you're going to run over some really good insights and feedback that you can get from people to really make the space the best it can be. So if you've gone through this kind of observation and investigation process, usually we start to kind of bucket stuff into what I said, like our activity patterns. And we say they're not work because not all of them necessarily relate to work. So it could be just reading, and that could be more from a casual perspective. Writing, that can be somewhat broad. It can be work related. It can be pleasure related. Computer work, again, can be broad. We do segment out, especially now, phone and tablet work. They only because they can be done in different postures and, you know, work in different pieces of furniture. Social, so like gathering in groups, and which is different than meeting. We segment those out separately just because meeting usually means table. Usually we're gathering together around a fixed point, piece of technology. People are bringing items that they're going to need to work with. Writing requires a table, same thing with meeting. Any good meeting should have somebody be taking notes, leaving the actual steps. So you're kind of in a different environment versus social. Could be gathered around a table. Sometimes there's a fixed point, but it doesn't mean to be a high table. It could be more relaxed, just conversation taking place, which doesn't require a table. It could be social where people are working. I think what happens is that, especially in academic environments, especially college, university, K through 12, it can be hard to distinguish social/meeting because the gathering can kind of flip back and forth. But we like to try to kind of drive that wedge to understand, hey, there is a social gathering element, and then there's a meeting element. And then this last item, we call it multi-item. You know, a lot of our work is done through higher ed, so this is what we equate to studying. But again, multi-item work is going to usually need to take place around a table. You're going to have computer, notebook, phone, beverage, bag. You're going to need a certain amount of real estate to conduct what you're doing. So we kind of segment that out on its own. So once we start to understand those activity patterns, and I just want to iterate too, is that it doesn't have to be these exact ones. You may be observing a space and you may say, I'm really only seeing 3 or 4 different activity patterns. You may say, I'm seeing more than, 10. I would just caution you, say, you may be splicing the pie a little too thin. Somewhere between, 3 to 4 to 5 activity patterns is kind of where you want to start to land in creating those buckets. So from there, looking at, different kind of furniture types. So the standing, this upright sit, and the more reclined, no table. I'm talking about a lounge seating there. So looking at, we're calling standing. And so standing, we were saying, is tables that are 39 to 42 inches high. We're including Galen's perching into the standing height only because it's going to require a taller table to conduct that. So when we'll see the benefit of perching in as it relates to activity patterns, but we're kind of putting it in that bucket right now. It's its own new kind of emerging way to kind of think about seating. So eventually, I think in a perfect world, Galen would like to see it as its own. But right now, for our understandings, we're grouping it in as far as standing goes. And so what's nice about it is it gets this open body posture position, like Galen was talking about. So then you have your upright sit, and this is where, probably the most traditional seating has landed, side chairs, pull-up chairs. Again, you're a more closed body posture. And so we just want to recognize that and understand what's the best working environment for that. And so we'll tackle that here in the section when we look at activities related to that. And so for here, like Galen mentioned, it's it's around 18 inches seat height. It can fluctuate a little bit. But this position has been established for a long time. I couldn't say exactly what the history is behind it. I think it's probably through people's kind of ergonomic development and manufacturing development to streamline X, Y, and Z for whatever it may be. But we've always landed around somewhere around 18 inches. And then with a table height being 29 to 30 inches high. So we see the biggest connect is we've seen a heavy influence of soft seating into spaces. And we've talked about this in some of our other webinars in regards to booth seating or banquettes. So the tricky part is that, you know, the banquettes are not lounge chairs. They share a different posture. So if you look at like a banquette or a booth, it should really have the same kind of seating profile or closer to the same seating profile as a pull-up chair, because it's paired with a table. It's going to be paired with activities that are going to require a table, more upright sit. The lounge chair is going to definitely be more reclined, sit probably lower. You're going to have this gap. And so we talk about this as perching, but it's a negative perching and not a positive perching, as Galen talks about, where you're going to start to get that curl in the spine, pain in your neck. And now lounge seating, it, you know, has its place, but we want to try to create as much of an open body posture position as possible. And what's hard with lounge seating is that I don't know if maybe because it's newer, and when I say newer, you know, in maybe the last 100-ish years, it hasn't been established as hard of ergonomic principles. It seems to kind of be the Wild West. It can be anywhere between 15 to 16 to 18 inches high, seat depths as deep as 23, 24 inches deep to as shallow as 18 inches deep. It's kind of all over the place, and so it becomes really tricky. So for example, when you're dealing with lounge seating that's too deep, you can see on the right here, you're going to start creating all these kind of very awkward body positions. And then as they get too reclined or declined, it again is going to start to close off the body there. So what we want to kind of put out there is with lounge seating, since it's not as established, and I usually try to give people information so that when you're looking through like a spec document or something like that, you can start to understand, oh, this is really a lounge chair. It's going to have a lounge sit. I really want to pair it, you know, for this type of activity pattern. What's tricky with that is that a lot of the information isn't going to exist out there. You can ask your manufacturers, and they should be able to tell you which, you know, what's the seat height. That's going to be the most common one. You know, around 18 inches is a good place to start. I know we're thinking lounge, it should be lower, but really pay attention to how people are using those lounge pieces, especially in an office and more public space environment. You know, even just sitting here, I was watching somebody sit in a lounge chair outside the window, and she's on the phone, and she's leaning forward to talk on the phone. She's not even utilizing what essentially should be the more open body posture that could be achieved with a lounge chair. So I think it's really important when we look at especially seat heights, that plays a big factor into it. From there, it's going to be tough because you're going to have reclines and declines on the chair with depths that aren't going to be listed. But the more you can test drive that seating, especially lounge seating, that's going to help the success of the space. So now that we've kind of went through the kind of different furniture grouping types, now we really want to pair them with those activity patterns. So standing tends to pair best with computer work, social work, and this is on the quicker side of things. So standing for more 10, 15, 20 minutes at a time, it's probably not the most conducive thing. You're going to start to get a little pain in your back. And you know, you got to ask yourself, if I'm starting to get uncomfortable, how well can I focus and be productive? But it's great for short periods of time, takes breaks, and they tend to pair well with these two activity patterns. Perching is interesting because now you're kind of crossing over between what would be, you know, more upright sit and the blend between sit and stand, and now it opens up these whole other activity patterns. And we've actually seen a larger trend towards higher tables. And we talked about this in one of our other webinars where now it starts dealing into this prospect element where I can, you know, I'm more upright, I can feel more part of the room, I can survey the space. When people walk by, I don't feel like they're walking over top of me. So perching kind of brings that into play and now opens up these other activity patterns of working on a tablet, meeting, writing, and multi-item work, things that are going to require that work surface. And then upright sit, like I said, it's that kind of perching kind of blends those two. You're going to have kind of the same activity patterns there. The key is, you know, when you're at that upright sit, it's really, you know, want to pair that with a table. That's going to kind of make you feel the most comfortable in these types of chairs. So anytime you think that someone's going to require a work surface, like to write, to have a meeting, you know, whether it's that multi-item work, I'm going to need to sprawl a little bit. You're really going to want to pair that with that upright sit. And then the last one here is the lounge. So looking at that more reclined. So it's going to be more casual activities. Again, like I said, if you start to go too shallow, like on the phone and the tablet, that's probably not as conducive. I'm sorry, not shallow, too low on the seat height. It's probably not as conducive. But if you're relaxing, reading, kicking up with a lower ottoman, lounge is a great avenue for that. So again, just to re-stress, I think with the lounge seating, you just really want to test drive it and really think through those activity patterns that are going to be associated with it. So we're going to start wrapping it up here for today. Just to do a little recap. So Galen kind of walked us through the history of the chair, history and culture, and how we've kind of built and come to these ergonomic standards that we've had, talked about open body posture, neutral body posture position, and gave us some interesting kind of takes on rethinking seating and opening our eyes to this perching element. So today I went over with you kind of this investigative observation process to kind of start understanding the space, looking at what activity patterns are going on in the environment and how best they pair with those furniture types. With that, turn it over to you, Helen.
Great. So like I mentioned at the beginning, we are open to questions, and you can use the chat or the Q&A feature. If anyone has anything that they would like to ask. I don't think we have anything specific right now, so I don't know if you or Galen would like to expand on anything in particular that you think you may have missed.
I would like to pick up on I think this issue of how high seats should be, the 18-inch business, because it is true that it's a standard that's been around a really long time, but it's also true that most women are cut under the thighs by that height, and certainly it doesn't serve children. And I think that the standard was developed at a time when only men were working in, banks, and it's a standard, I think, that's tuned anthropometrically to the taller male frame. And I think it needs to be rethought.
Yeah, Galen, I think you make a good point there in that, there's definitely probably been a bias. I think, myself being in product design, you're usually the first test subject in your product. And so I think if, you're kind of always test driving it out, like you saw with the one gentleman that made the bench that was probably a little too deep for most people, but fit him fine. And I think on top of which, there's probably a greater emphasis now than there was in the past on the human kind of centered element of product design. I think, in the early stages of industrial design, industrial design as a degree didn't exist really until roughly around 1940. And I think when it started, it was still very influenced by aesthetics. And, it wasn't until almost recently that we've started paying more attention to how the product really promotes health to the individual user. But it's hard to kind of reestablish a new trend that's been around for, hundreds and hundreds of years. So.
Yeah, culture is conservative. We like to do it the way we've been doing it because we can't think about everything at once. Even if we want to be innovative, we just can't rethink every single thing. So we hold some things constant, and that's been one. And I'm just going to say, well, I'm arguing that we need to shake that one loose a bit. And I myself designed my stuff to be 16 inches off the ground because I'm 5'6", and that's what works for my frame.
So we have been getting some good questions in just the last couple of minutes. One of them is, do you think that any bar stool could be used as a perch, or should one invest in a special chair with the appropriate angle?
No, I think a bar stool is a good solution because they're on the market, and you can get very simple ones, and you can get fancy ones. In other words, you can get a simple wooden one or more elaborate metal ones with more elaborate sculptural effects and so forth. But in any case, they're all on the market. They're available. So they're a good thing. And I'm beginning to think the British pub offers a good model for sociability that allows people to stand or to sit at what we now call pub tables on stools. And then they also have conventional right angle seating and sometimes upholstered. So they give people a lot of choice for coming together. And I think our offices should be a little bit more like a pub.
Great. I did get a question. What about places that have fixed seating, such as performance halls or lecture halls? Do you have any suggestions on how to kind of find seating solutions for those?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I assigned that very problem to my students the last couple of years, and they came up with beautiful, exciting alternatives, dividing the space into bands where there would be perching sitting, standing sitting, regular sitting, cross-legged, floor. So like they could have as many as 6 different postures in zones in a auditorium. And they're wildly effective, I think, but I haven't seen them built. They read really well as plans. And I guess I should get those pieces published because I think that is it seems like an impossible problem to solve, but actually it isn't.
Yeah, just to expand on that, I think, from a product design and manufacturer point of view, I think that the challenge that we're running into that Galen's highlighting here is that, there was an interesting study done during World War II to try to come up with the best pilot cockpit seat. And it was a team of people that went through and took measurements of all the people in the Army Air Corps at the time, I believe, and they designed a seat, and basically it was a seat that fit nobody. So it's really like you have to have it adjustable, because if it's your chair and your chair that you're going to take with you everywhere, it can be fit to you. It's challenging in the kind of more open environments that aren't ours, that are shared. We're all we're all slightly different individuals, and so I think we're the 18-inch seat height. It fits a lot, but also fits nobody to some degree. So I think from a manufacturing perspective, how do you create these products either through a number of product choices in a space, which I think is where we're going towards next. But that's hopefully not the final destination. I think that's a stepping stone towards how do we create products that can be more accommodating to as many individuals as possible.
So an interesting question. Do you have any information on research that has been done for those who are disabled and have to, quote, bring their own chair to the table?
I don't understand quite the thrust of the question.
So I think the question would be kind of how do you accommodate design for those situations as well?
Well, you mean if somebody has, say, rolls in their own, say, a wheelchair, for example.
Yeah.
So you can't have tables and chairs so locked into one another that there isn't a way to move a chair away and slide in another kind of a chair. Joe, what would you say there?
Yeah, we did this webinar to a group of librarians last week, and we got asked a similar question. I think I can't point to like specific studies, but I think we're as a manufacturer, what I'm struggling with, especially personally, is like how do we design? Design manufacturing has kind of been focused on the majority for so long because that's how you mass produce things. We want to produce one thing that accommodates as many people as possible so we can sell as many products as possible. That's how business works. But I think we're seeing a larger push and trend and more understanding that we can't continue to do that because there are differences. And while they're subtle, they are different enough that we need to accommodate that. And it goes when you go to, I would say, the extreme is how do you accommodate people with different maybe it's not as severe as a full mobility issue, like confined to a wheelchair. Maybe it's, limited mobility, that could be driven by, health or age-related things. It becomes challenging because now it's the quote-unquote minority, but in that minority, it's so many different facets you should have to start to take into consideration. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you to say that I think it's a growing kind of trend, and I think it's more on people's minds. And I think especially from our standpoint, as we're designing new product, trying to figure out how do we accommodate that the best. I mean, the ADA is the American with Disabilities Act, I think only been around since late 80s. So while that seems like a long time in the world of kind of manufacturing and mass production, it's still pretty short. And even then, it's taken a lot of time to gain traction on that. And I think we're hitting like a peak of more consumer demand for these things, and that's usually what starts to drive change.
One of the definitions of disability also includes people who are overly stimulated by being around lots of people and noise. And so that argues for some kind of alcove or space where external input is minimized. And that's probably nice for everybody to have a space where the environment feels different. Just to have variety keeps us cognitively and neurologically happier. And it reminds me of, the thing about the curb cuts, that when we made curb cuts for those who were in wheelchairs, it also worked for those of us who have strollers and luggage on wheels. And so thinking about the needs of people who are differently abled can be turned into a way to enrich the overall environment for everybody.
Great. I'll do one more question that I saw. I know that we see a lot of we have adjustable tables that can go standing height to seating height. Have you seen a chair that can go from seating to perching to standing?
Yeah, the closest that you're going to get, I think, in mass market is going to be a task chair, essentially. I think the task chairs, the problem that they're falling probably a little bit short because of that cylinder length. Again, that's kind of a geometry and manufacturing challenge. Cylinders are produced in mass, and so they're produced in such a way, and there really hasn't been a consumer demand. And I think it's starting to build up towards, I need to start to understand these different kind of seating postures. Adjustable height tables, again, is a very new trend when you look at kind of global manufacturing. In Europe, I believe it's now basically a law or a standard in the EU that everything in an office has to, all the tables have to be adjustable height. But really, it's been focused on sit or stand. I think what intrigued us with Galen is that it's kind of an interesting take on this in between. Standing for long periods of time isn't great, and sitting for long periods of time is great. And I have been an advocate of, there's sit or stand, and you should kind of do both in moderation and go between the two. So having this kind of idea of this blend between both, it's kind of an interesting perspective on it.
Product coming out of New Zealand, a guy called Bart de Vries, Devries, has something called the Limber workstation that goes actually from floor sitting and squatting all the way to standing, just without even having to crank or without a hydraulic button, just through leverage. And I think I'm going to be interested in following up to see how that is working in practice. So I mention it in case you want to go online and check it out for yourself before I get there. I mean, before I go visit in New Zealand.
Great. Well, we do have some more questions, which I have written down, and I'll share with the panelists, and we can reach back out after this webinar. I have shared the course number for the CEU in the chat box. It is and we will be doing a report on attendees and logging everyone for CEU as much as we can based on the information we have of who has viewed the webinar and for how long you stuck around with us. If you don't hear back in a week or two on credits, feel free to reach out to us. We'll also be sending out kind of a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar so you can share that and rewatch it as applicable. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to the brand@iida.org email, and I can connect you with Galen or Joe, or you can also kind of reach out to, you guys want to plug your websites here?
Yeah, you can connect with us at www.agati.com. There's a few sections, messaging expert, you can also just call us as well, and we'd be happy to chat, answer any questions.
And I'm Galen at berkeley.edu.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and we will see you next time. This is a series, so we will have another one in the fall that we will hopefully see you back for. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.